Well, hey folks, Dr. Grimes here. You are probably in the middle of working on your professional paper, and I hope that you're making pretty good progress and feeling pretty good about it. This video is being recorded because I had somebody recently ask me for a little bit of clarification on the sections of the paper because there seemed to be a little bit of potential overlap between some of the sections. And as I went back and looked at the instructions, I tended to agree that some of the sections do sound a little bit alike. So I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about what you might put in each section, what I'm kind of hoping to get, not to direct what you do, but just to open up your creative thinking process to make it perhaps a little bit easier as you talk to your professional person. Remember that the point of the paper is really twofold. Number one, if you're already in a working relationship that is not HR oriented, you might be in a position where HR is kind of the folks that the last thought, that they are the paperwork people and whatnot, and maybe they have a pretty vital role in your organization, but perhaps you don't necessarily go to them first because you don't know them. They're the policeman or whatever. So one of the things I want to do with this particular paper is force you to make contact with an HR person, hopefully where you work, so that you begin to build a relationship with that person. And as you begin to learn what they do and you feel more comfortable with that person, the odds probably go up for the future that you will feel comfortable picking up the phone and calling them when you have an issue. And they will feel comfortable coming to you and say, hey, I'm noticing this, or be ready for that. And that may not be something that's happening now. So if nothing else happens as a result of this professional paper, at least you've got somebody in HR that you know a little bit because you've spent some time talking to them that you feel comfortable with. And that's the first objective of the paper, is just build that relationship for the future. The second point of the paper is to give you an opportunity to step outside the class. As we're talking about things related to HR and what HR does and some of the things that they deal with, that's all coming from this guy who's on campus at GSW who doesn't do HR. He teaches. So you might say, this is pretty good theory type stuff, but is it real? And this particular paper will give you an opportunity to interact with your HR professional and say, what are you dealing with every day? And you can say, that kind of sounds like what we're talking about in class. Or you know what, that's a little different from what we're talking about in class. But you begin to get a real life, real world approach and perspective to the things that we're talking about. And as we talk in class about what HR does, at least in theory, with a well-run and good and well-functioning HR department, now you begin to hear from an HR person, yeah, we do that every single day, and that's one of the big things that we do. So again, the two purposes is you build a relationship, which is really, really important. You always hear about networking and knowing people and interacting people and building your spheres of influence. If nothing else, just so that you've got sources you can rely on later when you need it. But number two, to really begin to see real world perspectives on what HR does and how it works. So with that in mind, this paper is trying to get you to explore or to pick the brain of an HR person to see what's going on in the real world. So I'm going to share my screen here and call up the directions. You'll notice up at the top, first of all, it says HRM professional paper, but the paper is the same with both the HRM MBA class and the undergraduate current issues class. There are components to the HRM master's class that are over and above what the current issues undergraduate class does, but this paper is a good foundation for both classes. So if you're in current issues listening to this video, ignore that HRM designation. Yours will say CI, professional paper instructions, but they're, I think, identical otherwise, those couple of letters. So let's look real quick and let's see if I can make this thing go big screen to be able to look at it even a little bit closer. Let's see, one page, no, multiple, no, page width, no. There you go, that's a little bit closer and easier to see here. The first part is probably pretty self-explanatory. I even give you an idea of how long it should take. You will want to put Roman numeral 1 set up and then start writing. It's going to help me to grade it if you start with a new paragraph for each one of these things. So there's a paragraph for company, there's a paragraph for HR, there's a paragraph for person, maybe even a separate paragraph for past and present and recruit, but at least if it's all in one paragraph under person, I can tell where you talk about the past, where you talk about the present, and where you talk about recruit. So it's very obvious that you've touched on all three of those things. And that part you probably wrote without a whole lot of difficulty, wasn't too challenging at all. But where it may start getting a little confusing is in parts 2, 3, and 4. And so I wanted to take a minute and try to describe what those were. The state of HR is asking your HR professional person, what do you see going on around you? So part 1 of that is, what do you see nationally? And probably what they're talking about here is stuff that they're reading about as you look through the SHRM websites, and as you look at the headlines in the newspapers, and you watch TV, MSNBC, Fox, NBC News, whatever, that these are the things that sound like they may be HR related, and they're going on around the country. So one of the state of HR is that there is discussion right now about maternity leave, and there's discussion right now about marijuana use, and there's discussion right now about gender identity, and those are things that are going on nationally. And it may very well be that there are businesses and counties and states and regions of the country that are dealing with that right now, but you're not. So that, in terms of the state of HR, is a national overview of what's going on, a lot of which we don't have to deal with yet because other people are kind of playing and experimenting. The second part of that is a little bit different from the first part, and that is things that this organization that you're writing about is dealing right now. And some of those are the national trends. But in some cases, there are things going on nationally that your organization's not going to deal with for another couple of years. So the things that you are dealing with right now, or that your HR professional is dealing with right now, are things that were in the national scope a couple of years ago. And as they have been resolved in other areas of the country, now they're filtering down to where you are. So you might look at this from the perspective that national is what's going on around us that hasn't hit us yet, that might hit us in a couple of years. Organization is, what are those things that have been played with nationally for a couple of years now that we're starting to have to deal with in our organization? That's the state of HR. The trends outlook, part number 3, is a little bit different from those things. And what I'm looking for in the trends is ideas that your HR professional comes up with where you say, this is not even really being talked about widespread around the country yet, but I think it's going to be pretty soon. It's going to be a little bit of your perspective and your HR person's perspective as to whether something is what I would call a trend or what I would call the national state of HR. So something like, the way that we deal with H-1B visas, or the thing like how we deal with the illegal immigrant workforce, might be national state of HR. It might be trend, depending on the perspective that your HR person has as to whether this is an issue that folks are dealing with somewhere, or whether it's something we're starting to talk about but nobody's really started to work on yet. Similarly, whether we offer maternity leave in addition to or instead of our FMLA might be, from your HR professional's perspective, a national state of HR. There are people dealing with it already. Or it might be, from his or her perspective, a trend outlook. We're starting to talk about it, but nobody's really done anything yet. So the difference, again, between state of HR, national, is these are issues that folks are working on somewhere, and we're reading about what they're trying, what they're experimenting. Whereas the trend is, this is something that we're going to have to deal with, but it's still kind of on the fringes of the radar. Nobody's really dealt with it yet, but it's going to be pretty soon. Hopefully that helps you to distinguish a little bit between state of HR and trends outlook. For the issue part, point number 4 in the paper, I want you to really get your HR person to focus on some of the things that are probably in the organization section of the paper that they're already starting to work on a little bit, but you really want something that they haven't gotten 3/4 of the way through, that they're getting ready to make their final recommendations, that's still on the front end of it. And what would typically happen here is that for this issue thing, you've got all these HR folks sitting around in their offices doing stuff, and the CEO comes in and says, you know what, I'm hearing about this. What should we do? I'm hearing that there's becoming more and more of a demand for maternity leave, or that there's this kind of trending thing about paternity leave, letting dads have time off paid to take care of babies and so forth. That's not really ever been set in stone anywhere. We may be on the front edge of this thing. We don't want to wait until we're told that we have to do something. What should we do about it? So that might be something that your HR person says, we're just starting to talk about that. Or somebody has asked us about it and we haven't really made any progress yet, but we're going to be starting to look at that over the next few months or the next year or something. So it could be a national issue, state of HR. It could be a trend. It's probably, I may have misspoke on this earlier, it's probably not something that you would write about under the organization state of HR, because that's things that they are already working on. The issue for this paper and for the next paper is something that they might be working on in the very near future, but it's kind of on their radar now. There's a lot of talk, and there has been, about salaried people and whether we have to pay them overtime or not. And traditionally, salaried is exempt. We don't pay them any extra money for overtime. But the Obama administration, you'll remember if you've been reading the news, proposed that if you earned under a certain amount of money, then we needed to pay you overtime even if you were salaried. And that limit was like if you earned under $23,000. And they proposed that we change that limit to something like $46,000. So a lot of our lower paid salaried people would be required to be paid overtime if they worked more than 40 hours. And there was a lot of pushback that is too drastic of a jump. It includes too many people. It's going to kill us financially. So where they were making this proposal, I think the Trump administration went in and said, no, we're not going to do that. But you may be reading now where the Trump administration folks are saying we do need to address this, but it doesn't need to go from 23 to 46. We need to propose something that is a little bit more manageable. It also may be related to the issue minimum wage. And what do we do? What are we starting to do in our organization if we are told that we need to raise our minimum wage? Or what might we want to do proactively to start addressing some of that issue? So the issue here is something that the company maybe has started to talk about, but they really haven't done much with yet. Because I don't want you to report to me on what they've done on this issue. I want you to think about, at least in the second paper, the issue paper, what you would propose after you've researched it. You're the consultant or you're the HR person, and the CEO has said, here's an issue, what are we going to deal with it? You know, transgender has become a big issue. How are we going to deal with bathrooms? We haven't really talked about that yet. So that's a great issue. What would we do? What would I propose? And that is going to give you the foundation of what the issue is. Don't do a lot of research. Just talk about that issue and why it's an issue and how it could be impactful to our organization. In the second paper, the issue paper, you're going to take that issue and you're going to really dig into it, and you're going to actually make a proposal. So hopefully that, again, makes a little bit more sense. The state of HR nationally, here are things that are already being worked on around the country, just not us yet. The organization, these are things that maybe have been worked on around the country in the past, but we're just now starting to deal with it. And the trends outlook is, what are some things that aren't even part of the national state of HR yet? So if you look at this in terms of concentric circles, you've got trends, some of which are already being worked on nationally, some of which are now impacting you as an organization. So there's your national state of HR, your organizational state of HR, and your trends outlook. And then the issue, again, is something that is about to hit your HR. So again, the distinction between organization, state of HR, things that you are already starting to work on. An issue is something you're about to start working on. Now, hopefully that has cleared up a little bit of what you're trying to do, and hopefully this hasn't been created so late in the process that you got to go back up and you got to figure out how to redo what you've already done. But now you've got a little bit clearer picture, and if you haven't yet spent a lot of time with your HR person, at least you can kind of guide them. I want to tell you on the front end here, that this kind of a paper, there aren't very many wrong answers. In fact, one of the only wrong answers is I didn't do it. But what your person thinks is happening in the world, in the US, is that person's perspective. And what your company is dealing with or starting to deal with is really unique to that company. And what your person thinks is on the horizon in the trends outlook is unique to that person. So, four different people in this class writing this kind of paper may give me four different trends, and that's fine. What I'm really looking for is how well you develop your thought, how well you communicate your ideas. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time judging whether this is a trend or this is a national state of HR or whatever, because if you happen to be in a different part of the country, it may be a national state of HR as opposed to somewhere else in a different part of the country. That's an organizational state of HR, and to somebody else, that is a trend because they don't see that it's really happening anywhere, and to somebody else, that's an issue. So your paper is going to be unique. And I can imagine as I look at the grading rubric where I've got perfect and A and B and C, that if you make an honest effort at these things and you do a reasonable job of sharing ideas and developing ideas in a coherent fashion, there'll be an awful lot of perfects and A's. And once in a while a B if I think that you really didn't develop an idea fully. That doesn't mean you have to write pages and pages about it, but you at least need to introduce an idea, talk about it to where at least there's some clarity on what this issue is, and do it without a lot of grammar and spelling. So I project that there's going to be a lot of A's on this paper because it's just an overview of an HR person and what they think is going on. And we're not going to tell that HR person that they're wrong in terms of what they think is going on. If that doesn't help you figure out how to approach this paper, please text me, send me an email, even take the time and give me a phone call because we can talk about it a little bit. I honestly don't want to get, and probably legitimately don't want to get a bunch of phone calls, but I don't mind getting a few. If you think you can figure it out from this or from an email, let's deal with things that way. If you need to talk about it further on top of this video, give me a call and let's get this thing straight so that you do well on this paper. But again, I already expect that most of you are going to probably do extremely well on this paper because you're going to get to know an HR person and you're going to pick the brain of an HR person, and that's what the objective is. Hope that helps. Let me know if it doesn't. Bye for now.